Good morning, everyone. We're gonna give it 2 minutes to allow people to join, and then we'll get underway. All right, why don't we go ahead and get started?
Great.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Milan Dalal. I'm a director on the board of the Democratic Business Council for Northern Virginia. For those of us who are joining us for the first time, we're an organization based in Virginia that's dedicated to helping foster dialogue between the Commonwealth's Democrats and the business community. If you like our programming, please consider signing up to join DemBiz after today's event. A brief programming note: after Congresswoman Wexton provides our opening remarks, we'll have an opportunity for Q&A. There's a box on your screen where you can type in questions, which I will choose from. Please list your name and where you're from. We don't like to allow anonymous questions. So this morning, we're fortunate enough to be joined by Congresswoman Jennifer Wexton, who represents the 10th Congressional District in Virginia. In Congress, she serves on the Financial Services Committee and the Space, Science, and Technology Committee. Prior to winning her seat in 2018, the Congresswoman served in the state Senate and was a prosecutor and substitute judge. We're privileged to have her join us this morning. I'm going to turn it over to the Congresswoman to provide some opening remarks, after which we will have some moderated Q&A. Good morning, Congresswoman.
Good morning, Milan. Thank you so much for having me this morning. It's great to be here with everybody, albeit virtually. You know, these are difficult times. I don't think I'm saying anything that you don't already know. Our country is in the midst of an unprecedented public health and economic crisis, and now we're also dealing with historic civil unrest. And we can and we must deal with all these issues simultaneously. Addressing the public health response is how we're gonna help the economy, and we can and should at the same time deal with the systemic racism of our nation and the legacy of 400 years of institutional racism and discrimination in our systems. Now, in the meantime, we also need economic stimulus. We have taken some steps in Congress to make that happen with the CARES Act. In the House of Representatives, we passed the HEROES Act, which had a broader based stimulus, and that's now sitting in the Senate. And I'm not the only person who says that we need more stimulus and aid to states and localities. Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, made it very clear that another round of stimulus and aid to states and localities was absolutely necessary if we're going to stop the bleeding and enhance the speed and depth of the recovery. So, you know, we also did pass some important fixes to the Paycheck Protection Program. I don't know if anybody on this call has taken advantage of that program yet, or at least tried to. You know, these are huge, unprecedented programs being stood up at a moment's notice. So as we do that, it's important that we get notice from and input from the community about the challenges that you're facing and the problems that you're seeing. That's why we ended up coming up with the Paycheck Protection Program Flexibility Act, which we passed last week, which the Senate then passed, I think, yesterday or 2 days ago, and the President, I imagine, will sign into law in the near future. It's because of input from the business community about the duration of the loans, the inflexibility of the 75-25 split, and some of the duration of the loans that we made those changes. So please keep in touch about things like that, because input from the ground is key. And I'm here to listen and take what you guys say back with me to DC. So some of the other things I've been doing in the paycheck protection space and in the small business administration space is demanding more accountability and transparency from them. You know, we heard news reports about the pot bellies and the professional sports teams getting PPP money, and meanwhile, mom and pop businesses down the street weren't. So that's something that obviously was very concerning. And meanwhile, the SBA was not recording the loans by taxpayer identification number as they were required to do. So even then, even when some loans were going out and nobody was getting them, other businesses were sometimes getting loans 2 and 3 times for the same business. So obviously that's a problem. We need to make sure that we limit and eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse in these programs. And strangely enough, folks in the administration and across the aisle don't want any oversight or accountability of how they decide to administer these programs. Same thing with the money that the Fed is lending out to the bigger businesses out of the CARES Act. Now, I also got input from a constituent about issues with how the independent contractors and sole proprietors, how the amount of profits or the amount of income that they generate from their business is calculated by the SBA, and have requested that they update their guidance to make it more flexible for them as well, because we do have so many independent contractors in our district. So I'm here to listen, I'm here to help, and I'm eager to hear what kind of questions you have about what's going on up on the Hill.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I will start out with a question that we received from Michael Cook on some of the contemporary issues related to civil rights and some of the protests that we are seeing. And by the way, I think you hit on a number of really important points that I assume we will get questions on, from the economy to the stimulus to civil rights and what's going on in the country. So really appreciate that introduction. From Michael, he says, he asks, when I was a summer intern in law school in Philadelphia in 1971, I worked in a storefront legal services office on a police misconduct matter during Frank Rizzo's tenure as mayor in Philadelphia, an era when improper and questionable police tactics were rampant in Philadelphia. We found, among other things, that the absence of strong leadership at the precinct level and the assignment to minority precincts of the least sensitive officers on the force was a critical part of the problem, as was the allowing of racism to be acceptable conduct. While I recognize that Congress cannot do anything to replace the absence of strong, credible, empathetic leadership in the White House, and that many parts of the solution must occur at the local level, is there something Congress can do, both at the symbolic level and a practical one, to address this issue?
Absolutely, there is, and we will be doing that in the near future. You know, the Congressional Black Caucus is taking the lead on this. They are putting together a package of criminal justice reforms and police reforms that we will be seeing in the next couple of days. I expect that we'll see that package on Monday. And there are some bills that I've already signed on to. You know, Chairman Hakeem Jeffries, Eric Garner, prohibition on the excessive use of force act to prohibit the application of force to any suspect's windpipe as a way to take them into custody or subdue them. You know, that would prohibit these chokeholds or strangleholds that have ultimately resulted in the death of so many Black men in custody. And you know, there's also there's a commission, a bill to create a commission on the social status of Black men and boys as a permanent commission within the Commission on Civil Rights, to really look into and study the outcomes for Black men and boys and come up with evidence-based solutions, because we haven't really done a deep dive and studied the inherent issues that are facing them and what supports are needed. And so that would be another piece of legislation that I would gladly support. And there's also good legislation looking more holistically at police practices from the beginning, from training programs within the accredited criminal justice academies, all the way through community policing, all the way through to disciplinary practices and oversight, accountability, and transparency in those practices. So I anticipate that we can do that as in our federal, at the federal level, and we should, because you know, you have this patchwork of different law enforcement agencies across the country, each with their own general orders, each with their own training academies, each with their own programs. And we know certain things work. You know, we know community policing is beneficial. We know that there is implicit and explicit bias, and not all agencies require training in those areas. So, you know, they should. And we also know that the whole oversight and accountability process, the whole police discipline process, is very insular and closed and not transparent enough to the public. So we're really pushing the creation of citizen review boards and panels for a lot of these disciplinary and use of force complaints. So I think we'll be seeing that legislation in the next couple of days, and I look forward to working with my colleagues in the CPC and in the caucus to make some real and lasting changes.
It's wonderful to see your leadership on this. I understand that yesterday the Congressional Black Caucus and the Problem Solvers Caucus had a joint phone call where they discussed some of these proposals, and yet apparently the Republicans on the call opposed the prohibition on the chokeholds and a number of the other proposals that the CBC put out. How likely do you think it is that there will be bipartisan cooperation on some of the reforms with respect to law enforcement practices?
Well, this shouldn't be a partisan issue. I mean, this is a civil rights issue, and this is a protecting human life, the sanctity of human life issue. So it shouldn't be a partisan issue, but if they're insisting on making it one, then it'll be one. But it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. So I would hope and expect to get bipartisan support on this issue. And we're seeing a critical mass of people across the country who say enough is enough and we need to make some serious changes. And that's across the political spectrum as well. So I hope that they will take their constituents' views and opinions into account.
And finally, on this theme, we've had some action recently in Virginia, both in the city of Alexandria and then announced by Governor Northam in terms of removal of Confederate statues around the Commonwealth. Obviously, the Commonwealth has a deep history as the epicenter of the Confederacy, and Richmond being the capital of it. So deep history and deep wounds from the Civil War. How should public officials be addressing this? Particularly at a time when some of those wounds are reemerging in terms of deeply seated racial injustice ingrained in both in society, but also in law enforcement practices.
So this issue of the Confederate statues and of the statuary in public spaces is something that I feel very passionately about, and I have come to, and I practiced law in Loudoun County in Leesburg for many years, and walked past the statue of the Confederate soldier in front of our courthouse, day after day after day. And it took a while for me to fully recognize the import of that statue, because it was actually put up in 1908, long after the Civil War. But it was put up at the height of Jim Crow to remind Black people that there was no justice for them in that courthouse, to remind them of the legacy of the Civil War, to remind them of the legacy of the Confederacy, and keep them in their place, basically. And once that became clear to me, I became very passionate about giving localities the option to remove these statues if they wanted to. And there was, the law in Virginia said that it was very clear that localities were prohibited from not just taking them down, but also placing them in context and changing them in any way, or adding descriptors about how it is that they ended up there and things like that. And that shouldn't be. I mean, that's a peculiar affectation of Virginia, which I tried when I was in the state legislature to get rid of that statute and allow those statues to be removed. I did not succeed when I was in the state legislature, but just this year they did pass legislation to allow that, and that's because of the changes that were made in the majority of the General Assembly. So localities, they need to have these discussions locality by locality about what's appropriate for them and where those statues belong. I personally don't believe that there should be a statue like that in front of a public courthouse, but I think there may be a place for it in a Civil War museum or at a Confederate battlefield or something like that, which we have in Loudoun County as well. So those are the conversations that will be taking place. I did take this kind of passion with me to the Congress, and I serve in Congress with my former colleague from the state Senate, Donald McEachin, who we served together there. He's African American from the Richmond area, and we together got the governor to put in legislation to re-examine the statues that Virginia sent to the United States Capitol, because people may not be aware that each state gets to have two big statues in the U.S. Capitol. Because Virginia is one of the original 13 colonies, we get really great positions. We get the best real estate in the Capitol, and our statues are George Washington and Robert E. Lee. And same thing with Robert E. Lee. He wasn't put in there in 1870. He was put in there in the early 1900s, and so it's time for him to go. So we're looking. There's going to be a commission formed to look at who could replace him, and what we would need to do to make that happen, and to raise the funds to get a new statue in the U.S. Capitol to represent Virginia.
Thank you very much for that. It's great to see progress in our state and at the federal level on these issues. I want to shift to one of the very important topics that you raised in your introduction, the stimulus and the economic response to the current pandemic. The House passed a $3 trillion round 4 stimulus, which Mitch McConnell has thus far stymied in the Senate. Enhanced unemployment benefits run out at the end of July. And the small business PPP program was generally successful. You mentioned some of the implementation oversight issues with it, but money has basically run out there as well. Question one is, what do you think the prospects are for another bill that can be signed by President Trump this summer? And what does that legislation look like? Do you boost PPP further? And then I'll ask a couple follow-ups.
So we passed the HEROES Act, which is a comprehensive stimulus package, which includes everything from business relief to relief to individuals, to relief to states and localities. And one of the nice things about HEROES is that it included, for the first time, direct federal assistance to localities. So rather than have the assistance go out to the states and then depend on the states to distribute it to the localities within the state, CARES Act has a direct allocation for each locality. Even the smallest little tiny Hillsborough in Loudoun County would be getting an allocation. So it all told, the allocations for localities only in Virginia 10 is over $1.3 billion in the CARES Act. So that is very sad, very, very much needed. Revenues are way down for states and localities. They cannot engage in deficit spending. They're going to have no choice but to start laying off firefighters and teachers and healthcare workers and people like that. And there's no way we're going to see a robust recovery if we have 50 second graders in a classroom. So they desperately need this money. It also shocks the conscience for me for the president to be saying, okay, states and localities, you're on your own in terms of fighting coronavirus, in terms of getting the testing deployed, in terms of buying your own PPE and your own testing kits and getting them out there and deploying them, in terms of getting your healthcare workers protected and everything like that. And then saying, oh, but I'm not going to give you any resources to do it. So that doesn't make any sense to me. That's not at all fair. But so that's one of the pillars of another round of stimulus legislation, more aid to states and localities. Also another round of direct stimulus payments to individuals. One $1,200 stimulus payment isn't going to cut it. And for a lot of people were left out of that. People who are legal permanent residents were left out of that. Mixed status families were left out of that. Even the citizen in a mixed status family was not eligible because they happened to be married to somebody who was not a citizen or who was undocumented. I mean, that's not just. And so we're going to need another round of direct stimulus to individuals. We're going to need to make sure that we have more assistance for testing and tracing and quarantine and things like that, because the only way we're going to be able to really robustly reopen the economy and truly feel safe and reopen our schools and everything is if we have the kind of testing where it's easy to get and it's deployed actively in the community and everywhere and ubiquitous and you know, and on every corner. So so those are some of the things that we're going to need in another round, and we're going to have another round. Now, as far as the unemployment benefits are concerned, that's something that we're having a big fight over, because you know, the Republicans don't want people to be able to stay home and survive. They want them to have to make that choice between going back to work, even if it's not safe, and or going hungry. So, you know, it just makes it very difficult for people to make that choice, especially when the Republican, Mitch McConnell, has made it clear that the main thing that he wants, the pillar that he wants for the next round of relief legislation, is liability protections for employers, without any requisite protections for the safety of workers. You know, OSHA has laid down on the job. They're not coming up with regulations to require worker safety in so many workplaces. So that's really concerning to me, that they would want to give a blanket waiver of liability without any kind of worker protections. So I'll just say that negotiations are ongoing in that space.
I think your points are spot on, especially with respect to the huge fiscal burden that the states and localities are going to face. You know, with diminished revenue, you know, businesses shut down, tax collection, you know, just abysmal. And unlike the federal government, states can't print unlimited money, and many of them have to run balanced budgets constitutionally. So very difficult situation, especially in the fall when schools are, as you noted, are looking to appropriately socially distance and are going to incur enormous expenses. So that's a very, very important issue. To the point about you know, the additional payments to individuals and the enhanced unemployment benefits. One of the criticisms that has been levied by Republicans is that you know, that many workers are receiving higher benefits staying at home than they would have you know, working at their jobs. So yesterday, the Congressional Budget Office sent a letter to Senator Grassley saying that if they extended the $600 a week extension on unemployment benefits, that 5 out of 6 workers who would collect it would actually earn more on that than they would going back to their regular jobs. So as we grapple with reopening, is there a push-pull between sort of the public policy that helps people survive this crisis and ensuring that there's the appropriate labor available for a small business to actually have workers to restart?
You know what that statistic tells me? It tells me that employers need to pay their employees more. Because, you know, because there are so many people working these minimum wage jobs that they have to work 2 and 3 jobs just to survive in America. So that tells me that they need to get paid more. But yes, I mean, we need to find that happy medium where people feel safe, but we also need to make sure that people feel safe to go back to work, because you can't require them to go back and not give them adequate protections. And I truly believe that people want to work if they can, but they also want to feel safe, and they want to know that they're not going to bring something home to their family. So we need to find an adequate balance in there, and I don't think that we've got it yet.
Thank you. I'm going to take a few questions here that we've received, and folks, keep sending them in, please. Great questions so far. This question is from Lauren Hershey. Your remarks are very refreshing, and I thank you for all that you're doing in your first term as our Congresswoman. What are the prospects for immigration reform in the next Congress on the assumption that Democrats are in the majority in both chambers and the president is Joe Biden?
I think we will definitely see immigration reform as a part of any Democratic majority Congress and White House. I mean, you know, we still have a big issue to deal with the people with TPS. You know, I represent a continuing care rehab facility in my district for retired military officers. Okay, it's called Falcons Landing. Maybe you're familiar with it. And I met with them early in my tenure, and it was very interesting to me because the issues that they wanted to talk to me about weren't about VA issues with the VA or about military retiree benefits or things like that. They wanted to talk about people with TPS, with temporary protected status, because they had a workforce that included a lot of folks who were in this country on TPS, had been with them for, in some cases, more than a decade or two. And these people were like family, and they were going to lose their protection. So it's not just the dreamers who need the protection, it's TPS, it's other people as well. So this is something that shouldn't be a political fight, yet it always is. Ronald Reagan was one of the big proponents, and so was George W. Bush, were big proponents of immigration reform, and had big immigration bills during their tenures. So I think that this is long overdue, and something that we will see if we do make some improvements to the makeup of Congress and the White House.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go to another question here that we received from Catherine Tobin in Alexandria. Are you or your fellow members working on a plan for effective, fair, and very efficient dissemination of a vaccine when we have an effective one? We're going to need a clear framework, communication, and smart execution. Thanks.
Absolutely, yes, very great point. And if we've seen nothing from from how testing kits and things like that are deployed, is that there's no equity there. So yes, this is something that we're working on in Commerce and Labor, in oversight, in Congress. We're trying to ensure that we have those systems in place so that there's adequate materials and a fair distribution system. But again, this is another example of how the president really should have invoked the Defense Production Act early in his tenure. Just at the beginning of this pandemic, when it was just starting, a bipartisan group of Congress people asked him please to invoke the DPA for the production and dissemination of testing kits, of testing supplies, of PPE, and he absolutely refused to do that, to take any kind of leadership. He was much more content to pit the states against one another. So the concern that a lot of us have is that the president will use a vaccine as he has his other resources, where he showers them on his favored states and withholds them from his less favored states. Those being the ones with Democratic governors who sometimes disagree with him. So, we need to make sure that there's a fair way to distribute it. But I'm also concerned that we won't have the capacity in terms of the vials, the syringes, those kinds of supplies in order to manufacture and distribute the quantities we're going to need. So we need to start looking into this and be proactive.
I'm going to go back to, since Lauren Hershey brought up the prospect of a Democratic majority and President Biden, I'm going to ask a couple questions related to elections that we've received. So we're 5 months away from the November elections. Already there are reports that Iran and Russia are attempting to hack both Biden and the Trump campaigns and their digital resources, and engage in some of the nefarious activities that they engaged in 2016. So what measures is Congress taking to protect the integrity of the elections, our voting systems, electronic voting systems, and the security of the campaigns? And then do you think that there is sufficient cooperation between the administration and states and localities that are going to be administering the elections for November?
So this is a huge issue for the Democratic caucus and for anybody who cares about a free and fair election and democracy, because having elections in a time of COVID is going to be exceedingly challenging. And we all saw what happened in Wisconsin with the long lines on their primary day and the hijinks with the legislature and the court and everything trying to move that primary day. So the CARES Act did include $400 million for state grants to states to shore up and study their systems to determine what it would require to ramp up vote by mail and determine where the the lapses could be and what they would need in order to make that happen. But the problem with those grants is that it's not enough. It's barely enough to study the issue. It's certainly not enough to implement any changes that need to be made. And also the other thing is that it required a 20% match from states. And states don't have that extra cash lying around right now, even to leverage it for a 4-to-1 or 5-to-1 match. So the HEROES Act includes billions of dollars for states to ramp up their vote by mail systems, to ensure that they have adequate PPE for people voting in person on election day, and other reforms and things that they can do and helping them to shore up their election systems. Because I think the states, from my understanding from most of the states, is that they do want people to be able to vote and be safe, but they don't have the resources to make it all happen in the way that they would like. Here in Virginia, we're fortunate because of one of the changes in this year's General Assembly session, which you may already be aware of, is that we no longer need an excuse to vote absentee. So every voter can vote absentee, and I would submit for most of us, we probably should consider doing that. So you can request a ballot and vote it absentee without an excuse. So hopefully we will have the resources to make that happen. I understand that the state Board of Election knows that there's going to be a lot more absentee ballots required. And some states, Iowa and Michigan and several others, are actually sending all their registered voters requests for the application for absentee ballots and telling them that if they do want an absentee ballot, here's how they can request one. So affirmatively taking that step of helping people be aware of the fact that they can apply for those absentee ballots.
Voting obviously shouldn't be a partisan issue, but we've of course had the president criticize a vote by mail for some reason, even though he does it. And
he votes by mail, right?
Mail, and interestingly, the Republican Party in Florida has made a concerted effort to increase vote by mail, and they've actually been relatively successful in as we've seen, in terms of the electoral consequences. And so his opposition has really struck a lot of people on his own side by surprise. But I think what you all are doing in Congress is absolutely vital. And one of the concerns that I've had is that if we don't have sufficient protections for people who are actually going to vote in person, or are not making it easier for folks to vote absentee or by mail, then we have a lot of people who are going to face a burden when, potentially standing in line for 12 hours on election day, exposing themselves, unfortunately, to this pandemic, and balancing whether they jeopardize their job and their health versus their democratic obligation
to vote.
And the right to vote. So very happy that you're focused on this. I hope Congress will continue to do more on that front.
Right. And one of the things that people don't think about always is that, some people have to vote, on election day. Some people like to vote on election day in person. And the people who usually staff those polls are seniors, more than ever. They're seniors. And we need to make sure that they have adequate PPE and that there are protections and precautions taken so that they don't endanger their health or life by their volunteer activity.
Absolutely. I'm going to continue to urge folks to type in questions into the chat box, and I'll keep selecting from those. But I'll continue here on the election theme. So your election in 2018, along with those victories of Abigail Spanberger and Elaine Luria in other parts of the Commonwealth, came on the heels of Ralph Northam's victory in 2017 and presaged the huge gains that we had in the General Assembly in 2019. So some are now calling Virginia a blue state and no longer a swing state. How do you view the election landscape for 2020 in Virginia?
So I would not get too complacent, people. Virginia's swingy, and you never know. I mean, that's what we all thought when Barack Obama won when Virginia in 2008, oh, this is a sea change, everything's going to change. And then for those of us who remember Virginia's elections in 2009, I have some PTSD from them, but that was rough. So, you know, we can't get complacent, and we need to make sure that we need to put an exclamation point at the end of that sentence with our results in 2020, because we cannot, you know, we cannot go backwards. We need to make sure that we re-elect me, we re-elect Abigail, we re-elect Elaine. We have some opportunities to flip seats in the fifth and the fourth and the first, and you know, and we really should not take anything for granted, because we cannot survive 4 more years of Donald Trump.
Amen to that.
And I will say that Mark Warner, you know, Mark Warner, who was supposed to slide, you know, to just skate to victory in 2014, barely eked it out. So you know, we can't take anything for granted in 2020.
Totally agree with that. I actually worked for Mark Warner at that time, and so I still have PTSD from our near loss. And you know, I'll try not to remind him of that. But you know, we certainly,
he remembers. I'm pretty sure he remembers.
So you're obviously up for re-election in an unprecedented environment. How does your strategy of getting out the vote change during this pandemic? Do you have to devote more resources to online, digital, or traditional media sources? And what's sort of the strategy to get folks to actually come out and return their ballots in your favor?
Well, we're really in uncharted territory. I mean, nobody knows what, you know, running a campaign during a time of COVID is all going to be like. But we do know that we're not going to be able to depend on a lot of the things that we did in 2018. You know, house parties, I haven't had any of those. I haven't had any meet and greets. I haven't had any you know, in-person fundraisers. I've done all those things virtually, which is different. You know, it's not the kind of retail politicking that we're used to doing. And you know, one of the things that was so fantastic in our 2018 campaign is we had the most amazing field program I've ever seen. You know, hundreds and hundreds of volunteers coming out over the weekends and knocking doors, knocking tens of thousands of doors. And you know, I think back to where we were on Super Tuesday, and that was when we were in the petition gathering stage in my campaign, signature gathering for petitions. And I needed to gather 1,000 signatures. We had so many volunteers out. They were collecting them at polling places on the primary day. They were going out in their community and their churches and their workplaces and gathering signatures. And I needed to collect 1,000, and I collected over 5,000 signatures for my volunteers. Yeah, so that was pretty amazing. I felt really bad for the chair of the 10th Congressional District Democrats when we handed them to him. But that was, you know, that was in early March, and obviously that was just as COVID was really clamping down on Virginia, and we had amazing turnout and was feeling so optimistic, and then everything obviously changed right after that. So it's going to be challenging, and people need to still, I mean, you know, a lot of people are worried about the day-to-day, as we always are, but we need to worry about our future as well, and make sure that we get everybody out to vote. So I think our field program is going to be changing. It's a lot more phone banking. You know, we have had people doing basically community check-in phone banking, and our volunteers have really enjoyed that, just calling on people in the community. You know, a lot of seniors and folks who we're familiar with, and just checking in on them and making sure they're okay. Giving them resources, access to resources in the community if they need them, which is also helpful, you know, on behalf of the campaign. So that's been good. So, but, you know, we're probably going to need to rely more on paid media. So more on digital advertising, more on TV, more on mail, than we are on people going door to door and having those face-to-face interactions, which obviously is preferable. But that's why it's going to be really expensive. And unfortunately, we live in a very expensive media market here in DC. So the fundraising requirements still continue.
Well, it's wonderful that your folks are reaching out to seniors and others. I mean, one of the things that I've been really concerned about well, in every demographic, age demographic really has been that, as we shelter in place, folks lose that really,
Yeah.
critical human touch. And I really worry about children who are, young, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, where absolutely critical for them to learn social skills and interaction with their peers. And the more prolonged this crisis is, the more I worry about developmental challenges, down the road. It's different for a 5-year-old versus a 15-year-old to be sheltered in place. So,
Right.
but
But by the same token, 5-year-olds don't get social distancing, right? So they, so it's hard. So you can't have them in a group together and expect them not to like be up in each other's faces and hugging and kissing and all the things that 5-year-olds like to do. So
yeah,
it's challenging. It's going to be tough.
yeah, absolutely. We've received a couple questions on environmental issues, so I'm going to turn to those. John Cartmill in Herndon asks, it seems the administration is taking advantage of the current crisis to roll back environmental regulations. What can Congress do to check these rollbacks?
So that's exactly what they're doing. They're using this as because this is a distraction, and while that's going on, they're rolling back all the protections that they can environmentally. For those that they are rolling back now, we will be able. We're within the window of the Congressional Review Act. So if we do make some upgrades to Congress, which I'm really hoping and expecting we do, we will be able to repeal or legislatively undo a lot of those last minute changes that they're implementing now. But it's going to be a long time to get back to where we were and to undo the damage of this administration. I mean, they're doubling down on oil and gas and seismic testing in the Atlantic, in the mid-Atlantic for offshore drilling, opening up the Arctic Wildlife Refuge for drilling, things like that. We need to undo and make sure that we get back to where we had been. Same thing with CAFE standards and things like that. So it's going to take a lot to undo that. And the environmental regulations and the EPA and everything is just one of every agency where the same thing is being replicated, because we're seeing the same thing with rollback of consumer protections in finance, in the CFPB and in Treasury, and with the Community Reinvestment Act, and and same thing in Department of Education with the borrower protection rule being repealed and things like that. So we're seeing it across the spectrum in this administration, and we certainly will fight back against it when we have some better opportunities.
Wonderful. We've received a question on climate change as well. And as you know, Virginia is not immune from the effects of climate change. Certainly, we have parts of the state where in Norfolk and Hampton Roads in particular, rising sea levels threaten the Navy and its preparedness. And we have a question here from Mark Fairbanks of Winchester. Says, I'm the leader of newly formed Winchester chapter of CCL, Citizens Climate Lobby, that had over 30 members at their very first meeting concerning climate change. Naturally, we are concerned about the changing climate and how it is going to affect every segment of life, perhaps permanently. Do you have an opinion on the proposal of charging a fee on carbon and passing that money on to all families in the country? This is the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act of 2019.
Right. So I think that the only way that we're going to find a lasting solution to the carbon issue is by using market forces, and that's the piece of legislation that actually seems to do it, and do it in a way that's fair, and do it in a way that helps those who are dependent on oil and gas to be able to transition in a way that's gradual and safe and doesn't unduly impact those who are really most impacted. So I am really intrigued by this legislation. I think that using the market forces and having a rebate as a part of it, not just a tax, but also a rebate where it goes back into the communities, is key. And I know the Citizens Climate Lobby does fantastic work, And this is something where hopefully we will get some bipartisan cooperation, because I know that our colleagues across the aisle always like market solutions to things. And I think hopefully that there is at least a critical mass of folks who recognize that climate change is an existential threat to our country and to our security and to our planet. So yes, I'm very interested in that legislation.
It's ironic you mentioned your colleagues across the aisle. Some of the two biggest proponents on the Republican side are actually two former secretaries of state, Jim Baker and George Shultz, who have been, for pretty much the better part of 2 decades now, pushing for the country to take serious action on climate change. So glad.
Because they understand it's not just about sea level rise and things like that. It's about famine. It's about climate refugees. It's about, everything. It's about war-torn strife and things like that. And so yes, absolutely. So it goes much deeper than the physical planet. It goes to how it impacts everybody's daily lives across the world.
Moving from the sea to space, actually I have a couple questions related to NASA and space exploration, given your seat on the Space Science and Technology Committee. In Virginia, we have a pretty significant NASA presence with the facilities at Langley and Wallops. And last week we had a successful launch of the shuttle by SpaceX, and a private operator to deliver astronauts to the International Space Station. What do you think this future of space exploration looks like? And will we have, what's the nature of collaboration between kind of public and private parties? Do you see that continuing to increase as we move forward in terms of space exploration?
Yes, absolutely. I think we're going to see a lot of public-private partnerships in the space as we forward, because there are so many applications that are relevant to the civilian population, and not just the high-level research or the defense applications. And we have so many contractors here in Virginia 10 and Northern Virginia who work in this space and are very active in it. And I think that we're going to see a lot more public-private partnerships. And we see it not just in the defense side or things like that, but in things like the deployment of satellites and other communications and sort of aspects of space business, I guess is a good way to put it. But yeah, we will definitely see more public-private partnerships. And NASA has always had a very active role with the private sector as well, because of their civilian focus.
Yeah, some of the most important scientific breakthroughs have come from research funded by NASA, and so President Trump created a new branch of the military, the Space Force, to deal with growing national security concerns in space and the jockeying that's occurring between the United States, Russia, China, and other powers in space. Do you think that we are devoting sufficient resources both on the military side and on the public research side to space in general?
I do, there are, I know a lot of people were very skeptical about Space Force, and I don't know whether it really was truly necessary to create a whole nother branch of the military when the Air Force had their aerospace side and we're doing a fine job of it. But the threats are real. And so we need to make sure that we're taking active measures to protect US interests in space. And so, I'm glad that we're doing that. But the issue that I see with aerospace and with space in particular, and this is something that have more senior members of Congress have told me is a pattern, is that when there's a new administration, there's a new initiative. So, they have a new thing that they want to do. And so they may abandon initiatives from prior administrations and move on with a new one. And that's kind of what we're doing now with Moon to Mars. And, and so there's a lot of research that ends up getting and initiatives in NASA that end up being abandoned because a 4 or an 8 year cycle is not adequate to do a lot of the missions that they're planning for. So that's kind of an issue that is peculiar to administrations. You know, they're each wanting their own kind of mark on space. But I don't know that there's anything we can necessarily do to fix that. But it is a shame to see abandoned research and abandoned initiatives in NASA.
We received a couple questions related to your work on the House Financial Services Committee, so I'll shift to those topics. Michael Huff asks, with the continued consolidation in the banking industry, the nation's small banks have a continuous struggle to compete. How can you work to ensure they survive the current economic crisis and have access to liquidity they will need to help their communities recover? And I think that's a bit of a layup because you have been doing quite a bit of work on the committee related to these issues.
Absolutely. So small and community banks are so important to America and to our communities and to lending for the smallest businesses. And we saw that actually with the first rollout of the PPP, right? So one of the problems that we saw was that in the big banks, they wanted to lend to their big institutional clients. So the small mom and pops didn't get the loans from BB&T or from Bank of America or from Citibank. So they got left out of that first round. Wells Fargo was a whole nother story because they had an asset cap and weren't even eligible to participate in the PPP program until they got special permission from the Fed. So that's where the community banks and the smaller lenders came in. Now, I heard good things about certain community banks in my district. You know, Bank of Clark County, Atlantic Union, really got good marks from a lot of business people. And I was on the phone with small business owners every day during those early periods, you know, getting their feedback and finding out what was going on the ground. So making sure that they're protected is hugely important. They did get some relief legislatively in the 115th Congress, which exempted them from a lot of the more onerous Dodd-Frank requirements, which really were meant more for the SIFIs, you know, the structurally important financial institutions that are the huge banks, you know, that need to have those capitalization requirements. But you know, what we did with the second round of PPP relief was that we earmarked $60 billion just for small community CDFIs and MDIs and minority depository institutions. Make sure that they had that money to get out to those who really, really needed it. And that's when we saw the increase in lending to so many people who did not previously have that opportunity. So we're trying to make sure that they are protected. It is an issue that we are taking on with the Federal Reserve, with the OCC, the Office of Comptroller of the Currency. And you know, I'm in regular contact with the Virginia Bankers Association and the community bankers, as well as the credit unions, about what their needs are and trying to make sure that they are met. But it seems that they're doing okay right now. And I think a lot of people are starting to recognize that the big banks are not as customer service oriented as the smaller banks. And a lot of people, at least small business people I've spoken to, have been very happy to move their business to smaller community banks.
We've received one more question related to comments you just made. You referenced Wells Fargo and the difficulties they had in the PPP program. Julie Strandley asks, back in March, the Financial Services Committee held a series of hearings on Wells Fargo. The economic crisis has increased concern about financial exploitation of vulnerable persons. She says Wells Fargo knowingly processed payments initiated by vulnerable persons that are clearly being sent to criminals. As Fairfax County detectives have said, no one robs banks anymore. Criminals rob people in their own homes over the phone or computer. Will you follow up with Wells Fargo on this? And what steps are you proposing to address the system and the problem that's costing people their life savings and the economy billions of dollars? So I might ask that, Julie, if you want to privately send me your info, this looks like a more particular constituent related question. I can send that over to you.
Yeah, I would like to know more about what the particulars of that case are, because this is the first time hearing of it, and I know that Wells Fargo, I mean, Wells Fargo has there's a Netflix episode of Dirty Money all about Wells Fargo that has a clip of me in the hearing with them, all about, you know, the fact that because they were under consent decrees and under lawsuit for basically every area of their consumer lending and depository, because the fraud was so pervasive in every part of their business model. So I'm intrigued to hear what this issue is. It's the first I've heard of it. So if you want to communicate with me offline, I'm happy to do that.
So we're almost out of time, so I'll just close with one more question, and then have a brief programming note. The Senate recently passed a reauthorization of the FISA Act authorities overwhelmingly by a vote of 80-16. That came on the heels of the House passing something back in March. But the House and Senate have had significant differences, and Speaker Pelosi actually pulled consideration of the FISA bill last week. Can you describe a little bit of what the bid and ask is here, and what happens if we fail to reauthorize the FISA Act?
So the points of contention right now are, I will say that some important due process considerations were implemented in this latest round. So there's new amicus powers. In other words, because FISA by its nature is kind of ex parte, right? So there's no real back and forth between the sides argument about, it's just one side presenting their case. Well, now there's an amicus provision for a lot more folks, where there's a neutral third party who stands in to argue the case of the person that is the subject of the inquiry. So at least there's more privacy protections in there. The problem came from the remaining point of contention is more about unfettered collection of internet browsing data, for whether it be a U.S. person or any person, any foreign actor on U.S. soil as a part of this inquiry. And there had been the Wyden Amendment, which prohibited that unfettered collection without some sort of probable cause or reasonable suspicion, and that failed by a very small margin. So there was an amendment that was trying to be put on the floor in the House, which would limit it to any U.S. persons, and that met with a lot of debate, and people didn't want to agree to that because, and I get it, because how do you know what a U.S. person is? Who are you talking about, and how are they going to define a U.S. person? Is it a legal permanent resident living in the U.S.? Does it have to be a U.S. citizen? How do you know? Are we talking about businesses or people? I mean, are businesses operating in the U.S. persons? So these are the issues, and so a lot of people wanted something more broad. So there were folks on the right and the left who had issues with it. My understanding is they're still working on it and trying to come up with something to get a fix in there, and that we'll probably revisit the issue soon.
Wonderful, thank you very much. As I had mentioned, I used to work for Senator Warner, who is of course the Vice Chairman of the Intelligence Committee, and I recall I was working there the last time we had this big debate over FISA reauthorization, and Rand Paul actually blocked it, and President Obama was pretty upset because of the national security implications and sort of the blind spot that Rand Paul put the Intelligence Committee in during that brief interim period before the Senate was able to act. And so I know these civil libertarian issues are extremely important, and I do hope that they are resolved swiftly so that we maintain our national security protections as well. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Thank you everyone for joining us remotely and virtually. I hope you've enjoyed today's discussion with the Congresswoman. We had a very robust turnout, and we continue to host these virtual discussions with some of the Commonwealth and national leaders. We've had a number of presidential candidates during the Democratic primaries join us, and we were privileged to have you this morning, and wish you best of luck in your continued endeavors in Congress on behalf of Virginians, and best of luck in your campaign in November.
Thank you, Milan. And thank you everybody for turning out today. Stay well.
Have a great day.
Bye, you too.